This is the map of ancient Asia, circa 3500 BC, showing many different early civilizations, including early China, it was not yet unified, Mesopotamia, Indus Valley, and Egypt. This area specifically is where the Canaanites would have lived and thrived. Canaanite settlers, which again was a mix of migrants from the Caucasus Mountains, Hazor, and the surrounding cities, excuse me, connecting Egypt and Mesopotamia. Canaanites are responsible for our first written language. As a matter of fact, not just written, but also spoken, and their influence was so powerful that we see their influence every day in the very letters that we write. As Canaanite culture was directly responsible for the Latin language that defines most of the words that we use today. Vassal states under the Egyptian empire and also under direct Mesopotamian influence often asked for military help. The Amarna letters from around 1200 BC are just a small example of how well different cultures flowed, communicated, and worked with each other during these times. After the collapse, or during the collapse of the Canaanites and the major city states, immigrants that would eventually become Israelites moved to the highlands, and they became the Highlanders. They had a different diet, so no pork, focus on one main god. They were still polytheistic at this time. And they began throughout time to settle and grow their population. This leads me to Abraham. And yes, we have skipped a little bit of time. Abraham is Mesopotamian. Abraham left Ur, the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, which is in modern day Iraq. Abraham had a higher calling, even though he is from a high tech polytheistic hub of the time. Abraham was a man who decided, after seeing that his family's deities were not able to protect themselves, i.e., the figures and figurines, that obviously they are not true gods and there must be one God who directs everything. And he got this, again, based on statues of deities falling, of the sun and the moon and the stars. He was very high tech. So Abraham left Ur with an entire retinue and headed towards the desert, where he would run in what would eventually become the Israelites. Abraham's faith was based on a contract involving land, progeny, and loyalty to God. His grandson, Jacob, was renamed Israel after a spiritual battle with something or someone. His kids became the 12 tribes of Israel, semi nomadic outsiders on the fringe of Canaan and other countries, until famine strikes the east during the Hyksos Semitic period, where Semitic kings ruled northern Egypt. After their rule ended, they were either kicked out or enslaved. It should be noted during the 400-year gap between Abraham and Moses that the Israelites ran across many people, including the Shazu of Yahweh, whose obviously their main god was Yahweh. Sound familiar? I think so. This is written on Amenhotep's Soleb inscription in Sudan, foreign enemy list. Nomads of Yahweh, the divine warrior from the south, being a group of people from Edom and Midian, which is modern day Jordan and Saudi Arabia. Which brings us back to Moses, and we all know Moses. So when Moses flees Egypt, he goes to Midian and marries the priest Jethro's daughter, and he stays there for a while. Jethro was the high priest of Yahweh, which leads us as he goes back to the plagues. The plagues strike against Egyptian gods, so they're not just natural disasters. For instance, darkness is Ra, the sun god. The Nile is Hapi, who is the Hapi, which is the god of the Nile. All right, so keep in mind we're right around this area, okay? Jesus and his 12 apostles, as well as his main apostles, like Mary Magdalene, who was the apostle to the apostles, the teacher to the apostles, and Jesus' right hand man, if you will, and taught in parables, which is stories, about the divinity, the power, and the kingdom of God that is within us. His inner group of disciples include his brother, James the Just, who was the head of the Church of Jerusalem until he was murdered, Thomas, his spiritual twin, Mary Magdalene, of course, who is the primary financer as well as the primary teacher slash student, and Peter. After the death of Jesus, Judaism was split into three parts. There were the traditional Jews, the Christian Jews, and the Gnostic Jews. The Christian Jews would eventually become the Christians that we have today, and the Gnostic Jews would become the Gnostics who followed Jesus' more direct and exact teachings. So the Gnostics and early Christians battled it out. So you have the Proto-Orthodox, which wanted structure, bishops, and physical buildings, and the Gnostics, who wanted eternal knowledge and focused on the kingdom within. Both groups, however, were killed by the Roman government. Orthodox used that as building material, martyrs for the church, if you will. Gnostics stayed hidden, believing that the body is a vessel, it is not the primary spirit, therefore sacrifice is not necessary, at least not a sacrifice of your life. Gnostics believed that the Old Testament God was a false God who trapped our souls. Unlocking our soul and freeing ourselves from the constraints of life was pertinent and what Jesus taught, so that is what they went by. Orthodox was the physical world was good. You must follow the bishops slash church, big temples, because the bigger the temple, the more you're honoring God. So you can kind of see here where the breakdown is first starting. And there was a battle between his main disciples and the rest of his disciples. As it turns out, the Orthodox, the other disciples, are the ones that won out in the end, and we got the Orthodox Christians and the Gnostics were all branded as heresy, killed, or went underground and were hidden. Unfortunately, the Vatican won out, and all of Jesus' sayings were lost. The Vatican wanted to make a manual, which was the New Testament, and one belief system. Therefore, Gnostic teachings and any other teachings that were outside of the main Orthodox Christian, or Catholic, as they would say, church was not allowed. Leaders realized they had to become more than a commune, so transitioned from commune to imperial hierarchy, i.e., bishops, the Vatican. Basically, the Gnostics lost the design contest. Constantine, which brings us to this guy. This is the Roman Emperor Constantine, who legalized Christianity. The empire was falling. Universal religion was used to hold it all together. Between the Council of Nicaea in the year 325, which summoned all the bishops to create a unified church, the Nicene Creed. There was also the Edicts of Milan and as Christianity goes, the West was focused on the authority of the Pope and papal centralized legal structure. The East, or the Orthodox Church, was more mystical, decentralized, and approachful. Unfortunately, this would cause a great schism, meaning the church split into two. Most people were illiterate at the time and therefore relied on Gothic architecture and visual learning cues through stained glass windows and statues to teach Christianity. Unfortunately, the schism would lead to the first of many great crusades to teach Christianity and also to rid the land of the Moors, Jews, and Muslims that were also prominent at that time. So while Christianity was the means of doing so, it was really about control and the land. The Crusades alone is responsible for over 100,000 deaths. Over 100,000 people died to reclaim the land of Canaan, which is Jerusalem. This goes on for about 200 years and it keeps expanding over time, which brings us to this guy, the king we all love to hate, King Henry VIII. This man was absolutely diabolical, but we're not focusing on his crimes or morality. We're focusing on his divorce from his very first wife, Catherine of Aragon. While they were legally wed in the eyes of the Catholic Church because Christianity was now called Catholicism, he did not want it to be recognized because he wanted to marry his mistress, Anne Boleyn. And poor girl. So what did he do? He separated the Church of England from the Roman Catholic Church and kind of started his own little religion there. This became a problem for people such as monks who faced the dissolution of their monastery due to the king confiscating all of the finances, shutting down all the monasteries, and sending the monks out of Rome, as well as Martin Luther, who would go on to form the Lutheran, John Calvin of the Calvinists, who would go on to be the cornerstone foundation for the Puritans. Henry's great-grandnephew was our very own King James, who would commission the Bible to be rewritten and translated in the year 1611. This new Protestant Bible would be the cornerstone of Christianity evermore. Incidentally, it is believed that his favorite boy toy, George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, had a significant amount of sway over His Majesty as well as over his decisions. It should also be noted that the entire reason why Protestants became a thing is not only because of King Henry, but also because once the Bible was translated, people were able to read or have it read to them, and they realized that the Vatican was false, was not telling the whole truth, and just frankly unreliable. Therefore, they became Protestants, which eventually would lead us to the Spanish Inquisition. The fearless Spanish leaders, Ferdinand II and Isabella I. They were commonly known as the Catholic monarchs, and they started a 300-year destruction of Muslims, Jews, and Protestants in the name of the Catholic Church. People would be submitted to all types of torture of varying degrees. It was either convert and be Catholic or risk murder essay, genocide, live burning, or worse, which is hard to believe, I know. The thing is, the Spanish Inquisition lasted for a very long time, for a total of 356 years. Millions of people were murdered in Spain, England, France, North America, and South America. As a matter of fact, this was often used and cited as a reason to take over the complete genocide of many native tribes and extreme mutilation, essay, and worse. Because you see, in the eyes of early Christians and Catholics, if you were not Catholic and you were not Christian, you were subhuman. And if you were subhuman, then you deserved whatever came to you because you were barbarian. Again, this was the reason for the conquest of North America, South America, the transatlantic slave trade, and many more atrocities that have been attributed to Catholicism and Christianity throughout the years. Shortly after the Spanish Inquisition ended, we got to the American Civil War, which was another interesting part of Christian history because we have two factions, the North and the South, who are using the same Bible to justify their means, i.e., whether slavery should exist or it shouldn't exist. This created a great breakdown. So we had our Baptists, our Catholics, our Methodists, and it basically created a shift. That is why in the South there's a lot more Bible belts. People are more religious and deeply involved in the church versus up north. Just because the Civil War ended did not mean the war on Christianity ended. Thousands upon thousands of Native Americans were forced to walk trails. Their children were forcibly removed or stolen from their homes, had their names changed, forced to learn Christianity, forced to forget everything that they've ever been taught about their native culture. And unfortunately, the backlash of that is still effective today. And once again, this was all in the name of colonization and Christianity, modernizing what they would call the savages. These homes were often run by priests and nuns, which, despite the happy thought that that might give you, subjected the children to cruel tortures, some of whom did not survive.
Ivory comb. It doesn't really sound super exciting until you understand that this ivory comb was literally 3,700 years old. This ivory comb was made out of